Okay, Jason, it's all yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Hopefully this is going to work well. It sounds, can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? All right, that's good enough for me. So, I was doing a little, it's interesting. I was doing a little research into the Jewish secular community of Cleveland, and at first I was a little nervous about this presentation because typically I make this presentation to kids, to schools, to different groups here in Kansas. And while I live in Kansas City or in the Kansas City metro now, for the last 20 or so years, I lived in rural Kansas. And in rural Kansas, there aren't any Jews. And particularly where I live, at least that I knew of, and where I lived, it was kind of funny because our neighbors often, we had lived there for about, I don't know, 5 years, and our neighbors came over and they were like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." I'm like, "Well, sorry about what?" They're like, "Well, they saw, I think they saw the Christmas tree one year, and they're like, well, we didn't send you Christmas cards because we always thought you were Jewish." And because they would see a menorah when they walk in or a mezuzah on the door, and right around the corner there's the Christmas tree because my wife is Catholic and we teach our kids both. And then I would come up to the Jewish Community Center where we have spent a lot of the last 15 years. My daughters have attended the Child Development Center there, and they go to camps at the J and everything else. And everybody there doesn't think they're like, well, you're not Jewish, you do all this other stuff, and your wife's Catholic. And so I kind of felt like I'm in this world of, not belonging sometimes. And it's been very interesting because in the last 2 or 3, maybe 5 years, as I have gotten more involved with the World Federation for Holocaust Survivors and Descendants, that I realized that there is a significant amount of the Jewish community that is maybe kind of where I'm at, as my bio says, kind of Jewish, kind of not. And it put me a little bit more at ease. The flip side of that is I'm going to take out a little bit of the general history because what I do in some of these talks is give a little bit of Holocaust background in that. I would imagine most everybody sitting in the room there without being able to see you all understands, knows about the Holocaust and that. And so I will focus a little bit more of my efforts on my grandma's story. Um, Please, think of questions. I'm very much an open book. I know we're going to do questions at the end because it'll be easier. But if you want to write them down, and I'll take as much time as needed. So the story I'm going to tell you is the story of a survivor, Ilse Camis, my grandmother. And out here in this part of the country where there aren't as many very few survivors probably settled here compared to Detroit, where I grew up for my first 30 years of my life, or the East Coast or Los Angeles or other parts of the world. And I didn't people here don't often think about the Holocaust. And honestly, as I tell the kids that I often speak to, I didn't think about the Holocaust when I was 10 or 12 years old, so 40 years ago. I knew what it was. I remember doing a book report one time, but I grew up in a suburban house about an hour west of Detroit, and my family was didn't engage with the Jewish community as much. And so, average home, average size house, average income, but this really significant, now what I realize is was not an average history in a family history. Um, so when I was 10 years old, the picture in the top left there, well, I guess it would be top left, hopefully for you as well. My grandmother and my grandfather and me at 10 years old. And that was kind of when I don't know if she taught me much before that, but started kind of laying the groundwork, exposing me to bits and pieces. And my grandma and grandpa decided when I was 10 that I was old enough to go to Europe. And as you heard, I was one of two grandchildren. My sister, who lives in the Detroit area, is 3 years younger. She would later have the opportunity 3 years after I did. So they took me for 3 years to Europe, and we toured Germany and Austria. We went to England first, then went to Germany, Austria, then came back and toured England. We visited family. And I don't remember a lot about it. I remember visiting a concentration camp or two. I have a few pictures, but not anything that I could really remember what they were. But I do remember the impact it had on my grandma. I mean, my grandma cried everywhere we went. And as a 10-year-old boy, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I didn't know what to do with that and what to make of it. And grandpa would console her and sometimes console me and try and explain why grandma was crying. But it was that impact that more from an emotional side than anything. And so as I got older, I really was kind of what I would call a disinterested grandchild. It wasn't anything that was significant to me. And my grandmother knew that, unfortunately. So when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and I actually have some really great copy of some scathing letters that my grandma wrote me about my lack of interest in the family history, and she didn't even talk about at that point. It wasn't about her experience. It was just family. I didn't care about the family and all of this, and those are great letters to kind of look back on now that I have children as well. But I do remember certain parts of like when my grandma and grandpa had eventually they retired to Boca. And they lived in Boca for about 40 years or until my grandma passed. And I remember going down to visit once or twice a year. And there were certain things, little bits and pieces. I'm like, so why does grandma serve us fruit the day we get there? And then 4 days later, and every day for the next 4 days, we get the same fruit in the same bowl that now, what originally looked like a strawberry now looks like mushmelon, 3 days later because it just kind of disintegrated. And those were like these little lessons that grandma, that of course, I didn't know it at the time. I thought it was kind of funny. Now I look back and I still think it's kind of funny, but I also think to myself, wow, there was meaning in that. And until I got older, I never realized what some of that meaning was. So the picture down there in the bottom right, that's my grandma and I in probably 2019 or 2018 or 19, a couple years before she passed. My grandma had kind of a chiseled, old world about her, but she also had a really soft side. And as she got older, kind of a fun side. So the first time I picked her up when she was like 90, and I picked her up in a Jeep, and made her climb into a Jeep and drove her around Boca in a Jeep. She got a kick out of it. So had a lot of laughs as she got a little bit older and towards the end of life. So, she was born in Vienna in 1925. And family back then, was very similar to how it was today in the sense of other extended family culture was important in raising children, but it was even more so in her life because she was actually raised by her grandparents. We don't really know a lot about why. That was one of the themes of all of my talks is always we don't ask the questions when we should and when we have that opportunity. And not knowing the ages in the crowd, I mean, that gentleman in the front looks like he can't be a day over 40. So and look at, they're all looking around like, who's 40 in here? But what I will tell you is, regardless of your age, make sure to share these stories with your kids and grandkids. And even if are like me and they were that disinterested grandchild, some of that information will stick and it will play an important part of their life later on. So she was raised by her grandparents. We don't know why. It was not, it was something was never really talked about. Her mother and her father were divorced when she was 3 years old. Her father actually died in 1934, so she was 9. And from that point on, she actually lived full time with her grandparents. One of the early interviews she did with the Shoah Foundation talked about how her mom was nearby, but she never really talked about how often she saw her. They resided in an apartment in the Leopoldstadt section of Vienna, and I'll show you the apartment in a second. The reason I have the map up is you can kind of see where kind of her journey was I don't have arrows and all that, but from Vienna to eventually Harwich and then to the northern part of Great Britain when she ended up in a hostel. But one thing she didn't remember a lot about travel, obviously of Vienna, and I'll share some of that. But in the in Czechoslovakia, or what is now the Czech Republic, she did remember spending a lot of time in the town of Shafa, which is now known as Safov, and it was where her grandfather was born. It was a thriving Jewish community of about 5,000. And early on, Hitler pretty much wiped it off the face of the map, and now it's, I think, a shell of about 100 people in that little area. So this is where she grew up. Heinrich Coleman was her grandfather, and Marie was her grandmother, and they operated a grocery store in the second district. Their apartment was above it, so on the newer picture to your left, I took a few years ago, and well, probably that's probably five, to maybe almost 10 years old now, 5 or 10 years old. There's a door about halfway down with a circular top. There's actually a plaque on the building dedicated to Marie and Heinrich and about that. And they were really well known in the community, well loved. She always remembered them supporting everybody, and it was the type of store where Jews would shop there because Jews were prominent in the second district, but also Catholics and Protestants. She even remembered after, and I listened to this the other day, that original audio that she had done, an interview, that even after Kristallnacht, people would still come in, but there was a back door, and they would actually come to the back door as long as they felt safe. And there was a time where they didn't feel safe anymore. She went to school down the street at the Real Gymnasium. It was just a few blocks away, and it was a mixed school. And what I always thought was interesting, and she remembered it vividly, was they would go to school, and there were Jews and Protestants and Catholics primarily, is what she knew it. And they had religious training in the schools. So that was religion was actually taught in the schools for what she remembered, an hour or 2 hours every day. And they would be in class, and at whatever time the Jewish kids would go into a room, and the Catholic kids would go, and a Protestant kids, and a priest would come in, and a rabbi and a minister, and they would do religious school or religious training, and then they would all come back together, and never thought anything different, which is a very unique, I think, a very unique setup that obviously we're not familiar with as much here in the United States. So her life was, every bit as normal as mine it was as a kid until she was about 13. She remembered being able to travel pretty freely throughout Vienna. Even when she was 8 or 9, when her father was still alive, she remembers being able to go 4 or 5 blocks on her own to her father's apartment where he lived. But then Kristallnacht happened, and it was kind of that eye-opening moment. We don't have any pictures, obviously, of their apartment and that, but she remembers coming home from school that day, and the writing, some broken glass, some broken windows, and that. And like she said, many years later, they were just law-abiding Jews, going about. They liked Vienna, they liked the people, and this was such a new thing for them. And the store was closed, and she took a moment on the streets. This is one of her memories she always had, was she took a memory. She remembers coming home and seeing the commotion and Nazi officers or Gestapo there on the streets, and her grandparents had gone up the stairs to their apartment, and her uncle was at one of her uncles, and he went to help somebody who was being forced to clean the streets, rag, toothbrush, whatever it was. And quickly he was beaten and he was taken away right in front of her eyes, 12 years old. And she was lucky because a couple months later they were able to buy his release. He had been sent to Dachau, and his wife was relatively well-known oral surgeon and had a lot of non-Jewish friends, and they were able to buy his release. And pretty quickly after that, they were able to get papers and to leave the country. But now things had started to change, and she remembered not having the ability to move around as much. The big park in the second district where the Ferris wheel is, if any of you have been to Vienna, it's pretty famous. She remembers not being able to go there anymore. And it's kind of at this time, Europe, all over Europe, and this is something that has been interesting to me, that refugee committees were starting to pop up, and there have been some documentaries over the last 5 or 10 or 20 years about refugee committees, in France and in other countries. Obviously, Nicholas Winton's efforts, with the Kindertransport as well. And so trying to get everybody out, but kids, they didn't know any different. And she's like, for all she knew, she was going to be there and things were going to move on. I assume everybody in the room knows that the Kindertransport, about 10,000 children, primarily Jewish, but some others as well, primarily went to Great Britain, but other countries did take them in as well. Sweden, Belgium, Netherlands accepted some refugee children. And if you read some of the literature and the research about it at this time, it's my grandmother always came at it from like, these people saved me. I mean, she was forever grateful, and obviously, there were problems with it. There were political decisions about at the time. And I'm not one to go back and judge, and my grandmother was never one to go back and judge what that was or wasn't at that time. She was just grateful that she was able to get out, and sad that other people didn't have that, weren't as fortunate as her. So she ended up on the Kindertransport May of 1939. She had no clue it existed, and late one night, her grandfather and uncle took her to the train station with a packed bag, one packed bag, little knowledge of where she was going, what she was doing, other than she was going to the train station. She doesn't remember them ever telling her where she was going, and who, if, and they presumably had said, she thinks that they had said, we can't come with you, or you're going away to safety or something like that. But honestly, the lack of memory kind of makes me think there was a level of shock there. And I'm sure many of the kids had the same thing. They all just dealt with it in a different way. What we came to find out years later was that her mother, who was in England on business, and we that was all she ever told us was, my mother was in England on business. We don't know what the business was or anything else. She had gone in like 1938, and early in the year, and she had been working as a housekeeper, is what it turns out. But she had raised the $50, or 50 pounds, to get my grandmother out, and supposedly had helped raise 50 pounds for other individuals to get out as well, though we don't have a lot of documentation on any of that. So just, as I often say, and this is the most horrifying aspect for a kid. Imagine a train station, packed at nighttime under the authority of Nazis. A lot of commotion, parents crying and grandparents waving goodbye, and children not understanding why they were sent away to a place where everything was new. It was not a peaceful scene. The Nazis allowed the Kindertransport trains out, and in the middle of the night, and presumably because they didn't want people to know that this was happening and that they were actually letting people out. And, she climbed aboard the train, and she probably wondered, we often wonder, did she wonder where her grandmother was? Because her grandmother had started and then she had stopped. She hadn't come, and she didn't get to say goodbye to her. She adored her grandmother, and her grandmother adored her. She was an only grandchild at that point. She settled into her seat, and then she looked out and she saw her grandmother standing behind a pillar, crying, sobbing. And, I'm guessing her grandmother realized she would never see her again, or maybe that's what she thought. And my grandmother, Ilse, didn't know. And that's probably the most vivid memory of loss that my grandmother ever had. If For those of you who have ever seen the Kindertransport quilt, memory quilt, the piece in the middle there, from 1939 in Vienna, that was my grandmother's piece that she did for the Kindertransport memory quilt. It resides, I believe, at the Holocaust Center in Detroit now. It's on permanent loan. It was done by a survivor, and it is a series of, I believe, three or four quilts in total. And that was what my grandma remembered. So the three people she was raised by, her grandmother, her grandfather, and her uncle, she never saw any of them again. And the details of the train ride were spotty at best. Even in her first interview, she said, which was done about 30 years ago, 1995. She said she doesn't remember a lot about it. And some people have a significant memory of that train ride. It could have been in the middle because it was the middle of the night. She thinks she slept for part of it. Um, but it was nothing she ever recalled. Hours later, when the train arrived in Holland, is when it came back into focus, and she remembered the food and the delivery of food on the train, food and tea, either being walked onto the train or passed through the windows. And so, if you can imagine a train full of kids primarily, 100 youth, and just this brief stop and maybe some excitement around the fact that they get to see people. They don't know where they're going. Maybe some of the crying has subsided, maybe not. But it was a short stop. And typically, those stops were 20 to 30 minutes. And then they were moving on to the Hook of Holland. Um, and that's where life began in a different way for my grandma. Um, she uh, she hopped on the boat and she headed to Harwich, which is where most of the Kindertransport kids landed, was in Harwich. Um, this is an exam. This if in the Liverpool Street Station, the statues on the right, kind of a scene of what it might have looked like. The kids were probably a little bit in awe. And then Hope Square is what is it's known there as. There's actually now, as of a year or two ago, there is an actual statue and in Harwich. Um, but for my grandma, it was an exciting moment. Little did she know it was going to be an exciting moment because she got there, no familiarity, and guess who was there? Her mother. And she was just blown away. And she hadn't seen her in over a year. And even though she wasn't raised by her, it was her mother, and it was some sense of familiarity. Um, there wasn't a lot of time. She basically got to stay with her for 2 nights. She thinks they stayed at a hotel or a house there in the area. But her mother didn't have the means. She didn't have a place where she could have her live with her. And, she hadn't raised her either for many years. And so there could have been some of that too. So she was sent on a train in May of 1939 to a hostel in northern England, in Tynemouth. And it's about a 5-hour train ride to the northern part of England. And that is what became her home for the next 3 years. Percy Park, 55 Percy Park is the name of the hostel. Um, they cared for over 22 girls. There actually is a really interesting, I don't have it in here and it'd be long, it's a long read. Somebody about 20, 30 years ago did a historical look at the hostel, and it has pictures from various years that they were able to find, some information about the hostel itself, how it came to be. Basically, it was a Jewish committee that had formed. It was not an organized, we'll call it an organized. It wasn't like one of our organized groups. They raised money and they did, a bunch of stuff. But even when the gentleman who wrote this history said there are no minutes, there were never any minutes kept of these meetings. It was almost like they knew they just wanted to they wanted to help, but they didn't want any record of it, of what they were doing or should there be any issues. And so this Jewish committee raised the money to buy this house, or to lease the house for that matter, and to hire a house matron who also hired an assistant matron, and then to receive at least 20 girls. And over the years, I don't know how many total girls went through there. I know there were about 22 at the time my grandma was there. My grandma was 14, about 14 years old. And one of the older girls, probably a half dozen of them were at that age, and many came younger. And they kind of classified them into little and middle and big, and the little ones and the big ones took care of the little and the middle ones. Um, so what gave her a little bit of a different experience, and the experience at the hostel has been documented There was actually a BBC series that came out a couple years ago called The Girls. And the individual who bought this home about 10 years ago had no clue that this house had been a hostel in during the war. And so it came to be, they found out, they were very open about it. They allowed the plaque to be put there, and then they allowed them to do this story, this five-part story on the BBC. And so for my grandma, what was unique was the lady who was the house mother was Alice Erbach, and she was a well-known Viennese chef. And the where the tie came in is her mother had actually taken cooking classes from her in the late 1920s. We don't, the way we know that that was the case is we actually have the notes from the classes. And those notes and came accompanied some some recipes, essentially, not really a cookbook, but some recipes. And they were all in German, not anything that I could do anything with. So not too long ago, I actually sent them to the Museum of Exile in Berlin, and they will be on exhibit in a couple years with a Cooking in Exile exhibit. But when I say Alice Erbach was a famous Viennese chef, even till when she died in the 1980s, she had said that she was Julia Child before before Julia Child, and it really comes to play in the sense that she had this is her original cookbook. It was published in 1935. It's fully in German. So of course I can't read any of it, but it's got some great images, even some color pictures in it at the time. Not a lot, just a few. An amazing book. And so when my grandma landed at the hostel, she naturally took on this role, partly I think because she knew Alice or knew of Alice, and also my grandma had that caretaking personality. So while she got to have this experience here, like you can see the girls at the beach or the girls doing fun things and dressed up for pictures. And by the way, my grandmother is laying down in the top left picture. She's the one laying down across a couple of girls' legs. She's pretty much the shortest woman in every one of these because grandma was like 4'11". She's the short lady in the picture of the four girls at the top. And then in the bottom one, she is on the top row on the bottom left, or the top row on the left. This is another picture, and this is Alice Erbach and Vivian Sieber, who were the matron. And so Alice was a chef, and Vivian Sieber, or I'm sorry, Paulus Vivian Sieber, she had owned a theater in Vienna. And so they were the two matrons. Another one of these is from the local Jewish community, and then one of these is one of the other girls whose name we don't have. But so she spent a lot of time with them, cooking, cleaning. My grandma always remembered the kids coming. They would cry, they would wet beds. There was definitely a level of not sternness, but my grandma and it was even documented in some of this that they had to, they had 20 kids who spoke no English primarily. These kids, my grandma remembered the girl from the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia who didn't speak German either. And I don't know what she spoke, but she couldn't communicate with anybody. And so like these were big, significant challenges throughout the time. But she adapted and she figured that this was her place, and this was going to be her place for a number of years. It turned out that it was for 3 years until she basically aged out. And that was not necessarily by her choice, but that was kind of how they operated things at the time. So one of the things, excuse me, I'll take a quick drink. One of the things that I think is always interesting is history, and being somebody who never really liked history, I love the family history, I love this stuff. The more you dig into it, the more you find, and many of you have probably done this when you do, genealogy for your family. One thing leads to the next. What I thought was really cool or interesting is So Alice Erbach on the book on the left that I showed you, and that's kind of, we'll call that family prized possession number one, because the copy we have, which is the picture on the left, is actually signed by Alice. It was given to my grandmother in 1979, and it's an original copy. Maybe there's, I don't know. I've only seen one or two original copies ever. So there's probably not many that exist. I know Alice's granddaughters, who one is in England, and we talk to occasionally. She has a copy, but there aren't many. But what happened, and this came out over the last 5 or 10 years, much like art was stolen and looted. I thought was really interesting was that the Nazis, their process for doing away with anything that was Jewish, or not in didn't meet their specs, if you will, is they would steal authorship of books. And so they stole authorship. So the book on the right is essentially the exact same book. It actually is, I think that one is a copyright 1938. But there has never been anyone named Rudolf Rosch. That name doesn't exist. It was a made up name. Alice's granddaughter, who's a professor at Cambridge, spent years writing a book about how it's called How They Stole My Grandmother's Cookbook. And it's all about this process. And so I think it's a very interesting thing to see the same thing and to show, for a lesson for youngsters, this is a lesson in, that plagiarism gets found out, whether you do it today, as I tell my kids, or you think about it, 75 years later. So my grandmother, as I mentioned, she aged out of the hostel in 1943. And no, I'm sorry, yeah, 1941. And she did eventually go and live with her mother for a little bit. She worked as a librarian. That was her first job coming out. She worked for Boots the Chemist, which is a chain of pharmacies in England. And then when the time came that she could support the war efforts, she actually joined the Royal Air Force, the Women's Auxiliary in the Royal Air Force at the age of 18. And she became a flight mechanic. All right. So she went from an immigrant to England to a flight mechanic. And she eventually met my grandfather, Ernie, down in the bottom right there, who also was a flight mechanic. They dated, much like I guess other people did back in the day, dated for all of 3 weeks. And they eloped to Scotland because my grandmother was 18. In England, you had to be 21 or have your parents' permission. Well, my grandmother, or her mother, would not give her permission because my grandfather was not Jewish, which is ironic because she wasn't even around to raise her. So, but such is life. So they eloped to Scotland, and they began the next phase of their life. My father, Robert, and my aunt Susan were born in England, and they lived in England until 1956, when they came to the United States aboard the USS Flounder. Um, it was a significant change moving halfway around the world. And, I asked Grandma while she was alive why you did it. And she's like, we talked about staying in England. We loved England. It was good to us. It took care of us. But there were so many opportunities in the United States. It just made sense. And a couple of other family members had, like cousins had immigrated here, and it made sense. So they made their way to Detroit. When they got on the Flounder, they had 8 suitcases. It was a miserable ride, as everybody has said, for the entire family, I think. And so she decided to take up another career, and she became a dental assistant. So went from working on major airplanes to working in people's mouths. It turns out in 1966, she was actually the president of the Michigan Dental Assistants Association. And what I love about my grandma, she kept everything. So when she died, I got all of those records from the 1960s when she served in that role. But she built a good foundation for the family that way. My grandfather found good work in the construction industry, and they lived in the Detroit area until the 1980s, when they retired to Boca Raton. My grandma, she lived a great life. She died when she was 95, At 92, she actually was named the Volunteer of the Year at Boca Community Hospital. Um, she spent most of her days after my grandfather passed in 2010. Most of her time was spent either volunteering at the synagogue that they had helped found in Boca or at the hospital. And yeah, she was ever appreciative of those opportunities that she had had. Um, she was not one people always ask, and I find this very interesting because she was never one to lament how bad she had it. She always wanted us to appreciate what we had. She would obviously was never happy about the things that had transpired, but she felt very fortunate. And it's interesting because not too long ago somebody was doing some research, and we found a letter she had written on and she had written it, I think, on Yom HaShoah. I not exact. I thought I had a copy of it laying around, but it was basically a Dear God letter, and it was her thoughts and her questioning God, but also apologizing if she had ever come across, it was like having a conversation to God on paper, which was really an interesting thing. Um, my aunt said it best at her funeral that Austria was her place of birth. She loved Austria. England was her place of refuge. It was the country that took her in and saved her and saved some of the family. And the United States was the country that allowed her to be everything our family could be. And kids often, what lesson would she have? She always kind of talked about how we have the ability to endure, and we don't necessarily know what life will present us with, but we have the ability to endure, and that no matter where someone comes from, how they got there, what their story is, that they matter and their lives matter. And so I just leave you with this one. I think this is kind of a quote that sums up her life and her attitude. And I'll leave this with you. And now I'll just turn it over and answer the questions that you have.
Anybody have any questions?
Oh, I get a microphone.
Yeah, please.
So hi. My mother was born in Berlin in 1930 and came over with her parents in 1941. She's right there, by the way. She's 95. But
Awesome.
what I was going to ask you is she found records of all like friends and relatives and when they went to a concentration camp and where they went, what date they went, and the Nazis apparently took very, very careful notes of all these people. And did you find anything out about your great grandparents?
Yeah, actually, we have not found it personally. I have not, but my grandmother, what I all the box of records we have dates back to about 1980, and from the late 70s to till even the early 2000s, my grandma and my grandfather they wrote letters and the International Red Cross and we have different communications back. And for the longest time, my grandmother. For whatever reason, they believed that her grandparents died in Theresienstadt. But then one of the letters many years later actually said there was no definitive proof, but they believed they were sent to Treblinka. So we don't have a knowledge of where, and I think that letter stated in late 1941 or early 1942, and that. And so, kind of that same thing I was mentioning is the more you dig, the more you find. About 4 years ago, having been at one of the World Federation conferences I was mentioning, the Shoah Foundation was talking about how they do oral history or oral interviews, and they've been doing it for years. And so I just got online and I plugged in my grandma's name. Turned out she was one of the first. She did one in 1995, so almost 25 years ago, and nobody in our family knew it. And so I, of course, requested it, pulled it up. They at that time they were, and maybe they still do, they'd go to the survivor's house. So they went to her house. They had somebody who went to her house, and my kids got a kick out of it because I was watching it one night, and my youngest daughter came in. She's like, "Oh my gosh, that's grandma with hair." Because my grandma had hair, she looked young, and she was 70 years old when she did that, and she passed at 95. So 25 years later, and we bits and pieces. And what's funny is she did that. She remembered things, but even the research and the stories she told me afterwards were different than some that she shared in that interview. And I think that was both because she constantly was doing research, but also because as you do more, your memory changes a little bit. Maybe you remember more, that type of thing. So I found it somewhat fascinating, but we never really learned about some of the other family members, just vaguely where we believe they went to. The uncle and aunt at some point got divorced. There was two uncles. One died, one didn't. That uncle and aunt, they divorced, and the aunt went to Israel, and we've never been able to find information about her. We believe she went to Israel in the 50s at some point, but we don't know. And her name in Israel, there are great records typically, but we have never been able to find more information about her unless she changed her name or got remarried or anything like that.
Did your grandmother stay in touch with her mother in England after she came to America?
She did. So her mother actually came to. So when my grandmother made it to England, she stayed in touch. They lived with them until she got married, and then she was nearby. My grandmother and her, so it would have been her sister. Well, it'd be my great. Take that back. I'm gonna step back. So it was my grandmother's mom, so my great grandmother, her mom and her mom's sister, so would have been my great great aunt, who actually lived until she was like 97, so like 2001, she passed. The two of them, and that great great aunt's son all immigrated to the United States in right around 1950, 1951 from England, 5 years before my grandmother and grandfather did. We don't really know why. It's something I've asked my aunt. She didn't know. She was young. My aunt was like 4 or 5 at the time. She doesn't remember. She knows they left. They were sad. And that was part of the reason when they came, because they came to the US and people were already settled here in the Detroit area, which is why they chose Detroit. But not really a lot of knowledge. My great grandmother, so my grandma's mom, she lived until I was one, so 1976, she passed. And so she was around, but she wasn't an overly into the family woman. I mean, didn't dislike the family, but also wasn't overly into the family. Did kind of her own thing and some of that. So I don't know that my grandmother and her mom were ever close. I don't know that they were ever that distant, if that makes any sense.
Thank you for your presentation. I guess
Thank-
my question is, did you ever find anything out about how your grandmother happened to be selected through the process of Kindertransport? Any records of that? That's my question.
Yeah, no records as to how she was selected or why. If you read any of the Kindertransport history, just in the last year, Dr. Amy Williams has found a bunch of records that are probably more comprehensive than have ever been found. And maybe found's the wrong word. They've always existed, and maybe just figured out how to share them. She is now affiliated with the AJR, the Association for Jewish Refugees in England, and has released a lot of that. So one of the things that's been interesting is we found that the actual date when my grandmother left, there was one Kindertransport out of Vienna in May of 1939. And Grandma always said it was May 15th. That would have probably been that actually was the day they arrived. May 13th is the day of record. So my guess says probably middle of the night on the 13th, day and a half of train ride. I don't know. But that's where that comes from. How she got selected to be on it, we don't know. So she always said, and I'm assuming her mom always said, that she raised the 50 pounds, got my grandma on it. My uncle, or well, so I have another, it would be my grandma's first cousin. And we always knew him as uncle. His name is Gert. He's still alive. He was a Kindertransport kid as well. He lives in Detroit. He is Gert's 5 years younger, so he would be 95 now, 95 or 96. He was on a train in March of 39. So he actually went 2 months earlier. And we don't know how he got on early and then Ilse, my grandmother, got on later. Those are just things that I don't know if there was any way of ever finding them out unless somebody had that oral history of, hey, we raised that money and that's how you got chosen. We just know that it cost. And then my grandma even commented in her interview with the Shoah Foundation that her mom helped get other people out. We don't have any record of that. We don't know if that was just oral tradition, oral history passed down, or if there was some proof somewhere. Sounds great. But we have no clue.
I have a question. It's the same question, but two parts. Did your grandmother stay in touch with any kids from the hostel in England and any kids from the Kindertransport that she was on?
On the Kindertransport that she was on, not that we can tell. I've tried going through records to look at the other kids that were on there, the names, and they don't show up in any of the documentation I have about my grandma's life or anything. But yes, in 1988, there was a reunion of 10 of the girls in the hostel, and they found one had passed. 10 girls came, and then one called in from Australia or New Zealand, where she had settled, and they gathered in 1988. And then again in 1999, so about 10 years later, they all got together, and a few of them. And, you know, in the hostel, generally, from what my grandma said, there were, in her notes and stuff, and what my aunt remembers her saying, there were most of the kids, had the experience they had, right? It wasn't a joyous experience. It was probably pretty traumatic. But it wasn't, they were raised. I mean, the house matrons had to be tough and stuff. But there were a couple, obviously, survivors that had really bad memories and bad experiences and chose to shut that part out. One of them actually still is alive, lives, I believe, in Canada. She's probably in her 100. She's probably 101. She was older than my grandma, I think. My understanding is she didn't have a good experience or was not very favorable. And I don't know if that's because, the people played favorites or the house matrons did, but I think that was a big source of pride when my grandma, I remembered that in 1988 when, because I was only 13, I still remember that. And then many years later, and she often talked about that. And I have some pictures of their reunions when they all got together. And that was a very important part for my grandma.
Not a question, but just to bring this a little bit closer to home. We have here a retirement community, which used to be called Myers Park. It's now changed its name. That was named for David Myers. I believe he was the adopting father of Hal Myers. And Hal is mentioned at the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage here in Cleveland. And just a general observation, these stories always come out. They're always survivors. It just takes a long time for them to show up.
Yes. So I will add, one thing to that. It's been very interesting. So I've been involved with the Kindertransport Association, which, keeps the story alive about the Kindertransport, shares resources and that for a number of years, maybe 10 years. And I serve on the board. But more recently, in the last 5 years, I'm now on the board of the World Federation of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants. And every year we host a conference. It moves around. This last year it was in Paris in September. Next year it will most likely be in Philadelphia. And so what I will tell you is it's been very eye-opening to go. Obviously, less and less survivors. Less survivors every year. But second generation, so my father and my aunt's generation, and third generation like myself, and even some fourth generation now who go and learn. We hear stories. People, they can share, they can cry. We learn techniques for sharing those stories and for education and everything. And so for any of you in the room that would ever have interest or have that background in your family, I highly encourage you to give it a look. It's a great family feel, and it's a great blend of various generations trying their best to make sure something like this never happens again.
The question was raised how people were selected. At least in the beginning, I believe it was quite informal. A cousin was arrested the night after Kristallnacht in Breslau, fled to Berlin where there was family, and the family knew people who knew people, and he was taken to England in the first Kindertransport. So it may have been informal, who you know, and to some extent, I surmise that things were not written because it would have been dangerous.
Yep, exactly. And that's kind of the sense I got from the information about the hostel was they just wanted to keep it quiet and they had no problem raising money, but they didn't want to record anything in case anything would happen, type thing. And as you know, the Kindertransport, it was very heavy at the very beginning and it kind of waned a little bit towards the end. And then on September 1st, 1939, when the war broke out, there was a train scheduled to go that did not leave. And I can't remember if I've read that the individuals who did not make it out on that train, if there's ever been record of their loss or not. But that is one of the tragic stories about the Kindertransport. And then it goes a little further in England. If you read some of the history in England, there's a lot of argument, not a lot, but arguments about, well, this was a political move to make it look good. We could have saved 20,000 people. We could have had women and we could have done so much more. And, again, as with anything in history, I always think, I like to believe the good in people, and I think that's what my grandma said. And the good in people was they did what they knew to do at the time for whatever reason, and it's kind of hard to judge one way or the other, if they could have done more because we weren't there at the time, and it's hard to know what else they could have done. I mean, we could always say they could have saved more people, but we're just grateful for those that they did save.
We'll take two more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, based on all that you've learned about your family, well, how has it impacted your thinking about other cultures that have resulted in the need for refugees because of, human disasters and wars and everything? How has it made you feel about things that are going on today?
I think that's a great question, and I appreciate that you asked it because I don't always lead with my views very openly there because I never know the group and where people come from. As I mentioned at the beginning, I live in Kansas. There's very few where I lived out rural. There were no Jews that I knew of, and I always found it was a struggle because I would go to so I've been involved in Rotary for 20 plus years, and I go to a Rotary meeting and people would talk about immigrants. And I always hate when I hear people talk about classes of people in a generality. And because I'm like, people are individuals and you have no understanding of, in my mind, people have no understanding of what somebody else's experience is. And as my aunt and I always said, my grandparents came here, regardless of what your views on immigration are, people come here because they want a better life and they want a better life for their family. And, maybe at the time it was easier to get here legally, maybe not. I mean, I actually have my grandma's, here's her citizenship paperwork from 1962. Took her 6 years to become a citizen. And I think to myself, well, refugees are just looking for a place to send their kids, and things like that. And so, without, certainly don't, you're hearing my views, but my views are really that people are people. And, here I would hear too often that we think about people in this abstract concept. And I want them to think about they're human beings. That, and I still remember the time somebody made a comment. I said, well, do you know anybody who's an immigrant? And they're like, no. I said, well, I'm a first generation American. They're like, no, you're not. I'm like, yes, I am. My family was born in England. My grandmother, if somebody hadn't saved her and made it available for her to get out, I would not be here. And then they're like, oh, never really thought of it that way. Now, does it change their mind in the long run? Maybe not. But that's kind of my view and how I approach it now. When I speak to kids, the other part is when I speak to kids, my daughter we're fortunate. She goes to a private school that's really diverse. Maybe not economically, but it's very diverse in terms of color and faith and religion and everything else. And so with them, I'm oftentimes just sharing that, you know what, you've got to learn and understand people's backgrounds before you make judgments on who they are, what they do, all those types of things.
Like, one final question.
I'm amazed that these trains ever got out of Nazi Germany with the fact that the Germans knew about them and allowed them to get out at night. Is there any documentation about if these guards were bribed, people who took their kids, did they have to pay extra money to make sure that they got on those trains beyond the 50 that you talked about?
I don't know about documentation about bribes and stuff, but my grandma did say, like, she remembers them being at the station. And there are definitely stories I've heard survivors say, like, they would walk up with a bag and they would say, show me what's in your bag. You'd open it up, they'd knock it all on the ground and be like, they'd hand them, like, they'd either give them nothing or hand them an empty bag back, or a girl would grab a doll and they'd be like, that's all you get. And so they were taking, and she did say in her interview, she remembers them asking if you had any money. And if you had money, you had to turn over any money or valuable possessions. And then in some of the Kindertransport exhibits, there are pictures or there are items, artifacts, like somebody would hide a necklace in somebody's shoe, or something like that. But very few items like that. And I think you were probably taking a pretty big risk by doing it that way, in case they caught you. But they were also moving people through. I didn't know the night thing until a few years ago. That was a new thing that when I was doing some research, I found, and that makes a lot of sense in the grand scheme of things that they would let them out at nighttime because they didn't want people to know. They were, quote unquote, being nice at that point, still letting kids out. But it was probably in some grand scheme or grand plan for them. And that was relatively new because even my grandma never talked about that as growing up, that it was a nighttime thing. She just remembers going to the train station, but that's come to light in some of the research.
Well, Jason, this was fascinating presentation. Thank you so much.
That's all right. Well, thank you all very much, and have a great evening and a great New Year. And
You too. You too.
okay. Happy Hanukkah. Take care.